What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the worst draft pick in every single round of your fantasy football drafts. It's obviously good to have some specific targets you're looking at, but it's also very important to avoid certain landmines, because if you whiff on one of your early round picks, it's really going to set you behind. Even once you're getting into like the middle rounds, if you're just straight up whiffing on a pick, it does kind of make it tougher for you to separate from the rest of your league mates throughout the season. So just some players that I would be avoiding relative to their ADP. Yesterday, I went through some of the best picks in every round, so check out that video after if you haven't seen it. But let's just dive right into round one. And I'm going to go with Derrick Henry as my least favorite round one pick. He's really like a 1-2 turn guy, going off the board as the 112, the running back 6. I'm not going to say this is like a terrible pick, but when I went through the 4 for 4 consensus ADP, he was the round one pick that I had just ranked the lowest relative to where he's going. So he's my 204, consensus 112. I just think in this like 112, 1-2 turn range, I prefer Nico Collins. I prefer Brian Thomas Jr. at the wide receiver position. Even Brock Bowers, like that might be controversial. I would prefer Brock Bowers. Also taking Devon Achane at the running back position over Derrick Henry. And for me, this is just like a risk reward thing. You have a 31-year-old running back with a ton of tread on the tires. I understand he's been an Iron Man. He's just superhuman the way he's able to stay healthy, take on these massive workloads. But I think the issue is like there's some risk, right, with just the overall usage he's had. But there's not necessarily like this nuclear upside where he's probably capped at around like 20 PPR points per game last season, right? Hitting efficiency, hitting the touchdown department, average 19.8. It just kind of comes with the territory when he's not catching passes. And so, yeah, he could stay healthy. He could repeat last year. He could be the running back 4. All right, I draft him at RB6. Like, you're not getting a huge win there. But I do think just like without having that ceiling at the running back position, with his overall usage, I just don't want to be holding the bag if he does break down. Now, like I said, I have him as my 204, so early round 2, I think it's very fair to pick him there. I just can't quite buy in on like his price tag in the first round. Now, looking at round 2, I'm going to go with Josh Jacobs, being drafted at the 207 as the RB8. Now, he is my running back 11, and I have him ranked as my 301. This is actually kind of a similar argument to Derrick Henry, just based on like the overall ceiling outcome, where in 2024, I feel like what he put out there from a fantasy perspective was pretty close to his peak, specifically in this role with the Packers, where he was in a pretty weak backfield, right? Like it's not like he had a ton of competition. You had Marshawn Lloyd, who could have been real comp, right? Day 2 pick, but he's pretty much banged up throughout the entire year. So you're competing with like Emmanuel Wilson, Chris Brooks as the running back, 2 and 3 behind him. And Josh Jacobs still only had a 67% opportunity share. That was the 7th highest at the running back position, but he was used pretty heavily near the goal line. He was 5th in red zone touches, hitting the touchdown department with 16 total. And then you look at this Packers offense, they were actually pretty run heavy last year. They were 5th in carries per game behind the Eagles, Ravens, Commanders, Lions. To me, the Packers kind of stick out as like the odd team there, where the top 3 teams, Eagles, Ravens, Commanders, obviously super mobile quarterbacks. The quarterbacks are bumping those attempt numbers up. And then you have the Lions with, a statue quarterback with Jared Goff, but you just had, a stacked offensive line. You had 2 great running backs in Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. And then you had the Packers, and I feel like they were partly there due to the injuries. Jordan Love was banged up throughout the season. You had some Malik Willis games. You also just had Jordan Love not really at 100%. Don't think they'd like the full trust in him and his overall health. And so Jacobs put up 17.2 PPR points per game last year. I kind of have a tough time seeing him improve on that, because it's just like, where is it coming from? They were super run heavy last year. They didn't opt to give him a 70+% opportunity share. Why is that all of a sudden going to change up? Especially when you have Marshawn Lloyd, potentially in the mix now. He hit in the touchdown department. Are we expecting 18, 19, 20 touchdowns? So I'm just not sure where he's growing from here. But I think there's also room for him to potentially take a dip where maybe they're not quite as run heavy. Maybe he's not quite hitting in the touchdown department the way he did last year. And he's more of like that 15, 16 point per game guy, which is fine in like the early third, which is where I'm comfortable taking him. But mid round 2, I just think there's better running backs on the board, like a Jonathan Taylor, a Chase Brown, a Bucky Irving. And so I'm pretty out on Josh Jacobs at like a mid round 2 price. Then looking at round 3, I don't necessarily dislike this player, but 307 does seem kind of early for me. This is where I have Jackson Smith and Jigba going off the board as the wide receiver 14. Now, I will just put it out there that round 3 does feel very gross, especially once you're getting into like mid to late round 3. It just feels like a huge tier, and no one really stands out as someone that it's like, yeah, I want to spend the 30th or the 31st pick on this guy, unless you're getting like a falling elite quarterback or, a Tyreek Hill, T. Higgins, guys like that. If you guys want my full like top 200 rankings, the link is going to be in the description. It's free for you guys if you want to see where I have these players ranked in my personal rankings. But for JSN, he had a year 2 breakout, was the wide receiver 17, 14.9 points per game. And it was really like a second half of year 2 breakout, where in the last 9 games, he averaged 18.2 points per game. And so I think in a different situation, I could get around to JSN at this price tag, but he's a guy who's best used in the slot, 74% slot rate last year. He led the NFL in slot snaps. But the Seahawks went out and they signed Cooper Kupp to a 3-year, $45 million deal. Now, the Seahawks do have an out after year 1, so it's possible this is just like a one-and-done thing here with Cooper Kupp. Maybe he doesn't play well, looks washed, and they end up moving on. But they clearly trust Cooper Kupp enough to bring him in and at least pay him decent money for this first season. And at this stage in Kupp's career, he's really only productive out of the slot. Like, I don't think you can throw this version of Cooper Kupp out wide and expect him to win, at a high rate. You also just look at this offense as a whole. They're not projected super well in terms of like passing yards, passing touchdowns, pass attempts, probably going to be a below average overall passing attack. I do think this is a team that's going to want to establish the run with Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. They have a good defense. So it's not even like a team that's maybe not projected to have a winning record, but you're going to be trailing in a lot of games, like a Panthers type situation where you could talk yourself into a lot of volume. Like, I think they're going to be in a lot of like slow paced, kind of grimy, grinded out games where they're banking on their run game, banking on their defense. And then JSN's real calling card has been just commanding volume. He was 12th in targets last year, but outside of that, like, the efficiency hasn't been great. He was at 1.83 yards per route run last year. That was 42nd. Wasn't heavily targeted in the red zone. Like I said, he was 12th in targets, but he was only 28th in red zone targets. He's a lower ADOT guy, 8.7. So it's not like he's going to have these big chunk plays down the field. And so I'm just struggling to see the upside. Like, could JSN command a ton of volume, catch a ton of passes, and end up being like the wide receiver 13, 14, sure. But if I'm spending like a mid-round 3 pick, I want at least some sort of upside that this guy could be a potential top 10 option. And like I said earlier, I think in a different situation, maybe more pass-heavy offense, maybe with different personnel at the wide receiver position, I'd be fine paying this price tag. Like, if they were just running back the team last year with like Tyler Lockett gone, I'd probably be more interested with like Geno at quarterback. You have Metcalf, more of an outside presence, but this year just can't really buy in. So I have as my 405 as my wide receiver 18. And just looking at some of the other players I would take over him, I would take like that tier of running back, at least my tier, with like Hampton, Walker, Cook, Kyron. I prefer those guys. At wide receiver, I prefer Devontae Adams, Xavier Worthy, Garrett Wilson, and Mike Evans. And then even at quarterback, like, I'd be taking Jalen Hurts, Jane Daniels, guys like that. And in this range, I'm fine just throwing a dart on elite quarterback if I don't, love the upside of some of the other positions. Now, moving into round 4, we're actually going to talk about our first quarterback here, and that is Joe Burrow. He's going off the board as the quarterback 5, mid-round 4 pick, the 407. Now, I don't disagree with Joe Burrow being the quarterback 5. He is my clear quarterback 5. Like, I think there's a pretty big gap between quarterback 4 in, Jalen Hurts or Jane Daniels, and then quarterback 5 with Burrow. But then once you're getting into like, Mahomes, whatever names you want to throw after Mahomes. Like, I think there's a pretty big gap where Burrow's just nicely positioned in the middle. The issue I have with Burrow is a similar issue that I have with pretty much all like the pocket passing quarterbacks. He's not like a pure pocket passer, but he's not going to give you much on the ground. And it's just really tough for these guys to be like true fantasy difference makers, where when we look at Joe Burrow's 2024 season, from like a real life perspective, he was amazing, right? Since 2020, Joe Burrow's 2024 season ranks 4th in passing yards and then 3rd in passing touchdowns. So, a fantastic season. Like I said, from a fantasy perspective, it was only 18th in points per game, and it just shows you the value that is placed on rushing production, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns for fantasy quarterbacks. And Joe Burrow is just not going to have that. And so I feel like for Burrow to pay off at this ADP, he probably needs like an 80 plus percentile outcome. And even if he replicates the amazing season he had last year, I still don't even think you're sitting here being like, wow, what an amazing pick, because he still could be like the quarterback 3, quarterback 4 when you have Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels, who all have crazy upside at the quarterback position and could be averaging like 2 to 3 points per game more than Burrow, even in a year that, from a real life perspective, he might have been the best quarterback in the NFL. And so in my personal rankings, I have Burrow at the 4-5 turn. It's really not even a bet against just like him and his production. Like, I think he's going to be very productive. It's just from a fantasy perspective, it's not as valuable as some people think. And I just think the quarterback values also, like later on in drafts, are just too good to be like reaching here in mid round 4 and passing up on quality running backs and wide receivers. Now, moving into round 5, I actually want to touch on 2 guys in this tier. It's going to be Sam Laporta, and then it is going to be Patrick Mahomes. So Laporta, tight end 4 at the 502, Patrick Mahomes, quarterback 6 at the 506. And for Laporta, I just feel like there's too big of a gap between him and then some of the other tight ends going behind him. In 2024, Laporta was not a difference maker at all for fantasy. He was the tight end 9, averaging 10.9 points per game. He was not commanding targets at a high level. He had a 17% target share that was 14th at the tight end position. He had a 20.5% target rate that was even worse at 26th at the tight end position. And this was actually a season where he's still kind of hitting the touchdowns, not as much as he did in 2023, but 2024 still scored 7 touchdowns. That was 4th at the tight end position, and he just gave you like no positional edge, despite the fact that he was pretty consistently drafted in like, the round 3 area in 2024 drafts. And it really does seem like the emergence of Jameson Williams really kind of hurt Laporta's involvement, where he was no longer the number 2 target and he was kind of like a distant number 3 option. And so instead of taking Sam Laporta early round 5, I would much rather just punt the position and then take like a Colston Loveland, Tyler Warren, Tucker Kraft when you're getting into like round 9, 10, 11, depending on the platform. Even when you look at like the Vegas projections, like, yeah, he's going to be a little bit higher in receiving yards and receiving touchdowns from like the Njokus, the Ingrams, but there's not that big of a gap. And in a lot of platforms, there's like a 3-4 round difference between other tight ends that are projecting pretty similar to Sam Laporta. So someone I think is a pretty easy pass. And then for Patrick Mahomes, I also think this is a pretty easy pass. Now, you can pitch that the ceiling is certainly there for Patrick Mahomes. He has 3 top 2 point per game seasons at the quarterback position in his career. Since 2020, he has had the 3rd and 6th best fantasy seasons. But you're spending a round 5 pick on a guy who has been the quarterback 11 and the quarterback 12 in points per game, like production that arguably could be streamed from the waiver wire. Like, you have quarterbacks that are getting, those fringe round 1 finishes that could have started the year off, undrafted in a lot of leagues. And so it's like, yeah, he could put together one of those top 2 quarterback seasons, but to me, this is just way too early of a pick to, actually take that swing, especially because it's not like the Chiefs have made a ton of meaningful offensive improvements. It's not like they went out and made a big deal for a stud wide receiver or a stud tight end. And so maybe like you're talking yourself into a Xavier Worthy year 2 breakout. Rashee Rice was super productive last year. He does have the suspension, but still, maybe he's very involved. But then I think, those improvements could be counteracted by the fact that you could get a farther diminished version of Travis Kelce. And in a year where quarterback is so deep, there are so many quality options, there's just no chance I'm hitting the draft button on Patrick Mahomes over a wide receiver like George Pickens, a wide receiver like Tedero McMillan, running backs like Travion Henderson, RJ Harvey. Like, it's not even crossing my mind to take Patrick Mahomes over some of those other options. Now, looking at round 6, this is kind of where I'm going to start to just ignore the quarterback position because, as you can probably tell, I'm not going to be interested in round 6 Baker Mayfield. I think that price tag is crazy, but I will mention Joe Mixon and Travis Kelce. So Joe Mixon's being drafted as the running back 23, the 602, and then Travis Kelce's going off the board as the tight end 6, the 606. And we have seen Joe Mixon's value drop since the injury news. I just don't really think it's dropped enough. So he's dealing with a foot injury. He's not a lock to play week 1. Like, it's not like he's probable week 1. It's possible this thing lingers, into the season. And all of a sudden, Joe Mixon is a very, very risky bet at the running back position, where his upside was very centered around his projected volume, being the workhorse here for this Texans offense. Joe Mixon's really never someone who's been a super efficient back. He really had like one hyper efficient season, and it was all the way back in 2018. His value has come from just having that, workhorse role on some pretty good offenses with the Bengals, now with the Texans. But the dude is 29 years old. He's already getting into the age range where he might just start kind of falling off as a player. Now he might not even be 100% of that guy heading into the season. And who knows if he makes a full recovery, right? Like he could just be a diminished version of himself throughout the entire season. And then it's not like the Texans have like crazy tough competition with like Nick Chubb, Damian Pierce, Woody Marks. But you are in this spot where it's like if Joe Mixon is no longer the clear top guy, why are we going to force feed him when you have, a trusted veteran in Nick Chubb? You have Woody Marks, who like doesn't seem like a world beater, but they traded a day 2 pick for him to move up and get him in the 4th round. Like, they're clearly interested in him. And so it's like behind a terrible offensive line, if these touches start to get dispersed, where you have Nick Chubb taking some of the early down looks, you have Woody Marks getting involved in the receiving game, all of a sudden Joe Mixon just doesn't have a super valuable role. And so, like, I cannot consider taking him over guys like RJ Harvey, especially. Like, Mixon over Harvey should never happen. Even guys like Isaiah Pacheco, Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, like, maybe these guys' roles are somewhat suspect, but I do have more confidence in them just, like, being the clear RB1s. For Pacheco, Aaron Jones, I do trust the overall run game more. And then for Pollard, I'm just way more confident that he's kind of locked into that RB1 role, especially after the Tajay Spears injury. And then for Travis Kelce, I just feel like this could be a really, really bad pick. I did this video, I think, like a month or two ago, and I had Travis Kelce as the worst pick in the 7th round. His ADP has now risen to round 6, which I think is just the wrong direction. I think it should be going down. And we look at the 2024 season, and I think some people are just kind of writing this off. It's like, oh, it was a down year. It happens. For me, I can't really buy in on that because you have Travis Kelce, who was so unbelievably consistent, from 2016 to 2023. He was a top 2 tight end in points per game every single year. His worst season during that stretch was 13.8. And now in the year where he's really getting up there in age, he's the tight end 6 and 12.2 points per game. Like, to me, this is just a clear sign of him falling off as a player. And then you look at all the advanced metrics, and you can see that he is clearly regressing. He was nowhere near as good after the catch. He was at 3.9 yak per reception last year. He was 5+ the previous 3 years. From 2021 to 2023, he broke at least 20 tackles a season. In 2024, he only broke 5 total tackles, and then his yards per out run dropped to 1.49. That was after being consistently in the 2s, throughout his prime. And then you look at this group of weapons, like, it's not like they have a crazy wide receiver room, but you have a healthy Rashee Rice, who's probably not going to be suspended to start off the season. You have Xavier Worthy, potential year 2 breakout. And even with like just one stud wide receiver with like the Rashee Rice usage last year, first 3 weeks of the season, Travis Kelce was like a non-factor. Like, he was unplayable in fantasy. He was targeted 12 total times in their first 3 games. I think it's possible he's even a worse player than he was last year. And now I think you could potentially talk yourself into like, all right, he's going to get some volume. If the Chiefs are bouncing back, then he could have like a Mark Andrews-esque season last year where he's kind of hitting in the touchdown department. That's just not a swing I want to take here. And I feel like this is pretty close to his ceiling. I'd be shocked if he had some sort of like major bounce back and is giving you like 14+ points per game. Like, that really would shock me. And so round 6, just not interested in hitting the draft button. Now, looking at round 7, at this point, I'm kind of just looking at running backs, wide receivers. I don't want to keep talking about quarterbacks and tight ends. So I'm going to talk about Brian Robinson Jr. here. He's being drafted as the running back 29, the 707. And, all offseason, I've kind of been viewing B-Rob as like this high floor, low ceiling option. Now he's looking more like a low ceiling, low floor option with some of the reports we're getting out of training camp and just some of the hype that some other guys are getting. So in 2024, he averaged 11.4 points per game, was the running back 28. Like, he's like the flex option, like the desperate RB2 if you went like 0 or hero RB. And in his role, he's just going to have limited receiving upside, really hasn't caught passes at a high rate in the NFL. He does kind of have the archetype where it'd be like, all right, but he can really hit in the touchdown department. The tough thing with that is that you do have Jaden Daniels' legs, which, are a threat near the goal line, where he's still going to mix in, take some of those touchdowns. And then the usage just isn't great. Like, he was 26th in opportunity share. He was 20th in red zone touches. You have Austin Eckler, who is like still a decent player and had a pretty solid season last year. And then I think like the real killer here for Brian Robinson is the emergence of Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, where I think he was a 7th-round pick. He has been getting great reports out of camp, like consistently. He is getting hyped up, and he's a running back who was not known for catching passes in college. And so you're looking at this running back room with B-Rob and Austin Eckler, and it's like, all right, if this guy is making himself undeniable, what piece of the pie is he taking? And I think he is eating out of Brian Robinson's usage as an early down back. And so in this round, I like the values you're getting at wide receiver. If you want to go with a running back, this is the point where I look at a guy like Jaylen Warren over Brian Robinson Jr. at this point. And then I do think there was a beat reporter that recently came out and kind of had like a bold prediction that Brian Robinson actually gets cut before the year. Now, I'm not like fully buying into that. That's not why I kind of dislike him at this price, but it's certainly not great that you have a beat reporter even like putting that out there. Like, it could be BS. It's very possible he's on the team. I expect him to be on the team, but just any rumblings of that is certainly a net negative. And then the final round I'll be talking about today, round 8. My least favorite pick is Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 43, going off the board as the 8-11. And I just have Kupp like a clear tier behind all the other wide receivers in this round. And then even some of the younger wide receivers going later, like a Matthew Golden, an Emeka Egbuka, a Josh Downs. And I feel like I can just like repeat the arguments I made with the Seahawks of like not going to be, a above average passing attack, or unlikely to be, good defense, strong run game that they want to rely on. And then also just like the overlapping skill sets with JSN, where the issue for JSN is like, all right, Cooper Kupp can probably only be used in the slot if he's effective. Then the issue for Cooper Kupp is like, JSN's probably just going to be way more productive out of the slot. And then what is happening with Cooper Kupp? He's 32 years old. He really has struggled to stay healthy over the last 3 seasons, and he did look like he, had kind of taken a step back towards the end of last year. So pretty out on Cooper Kupp. Also just due to like the other solid wide receiver options. Like, I'd much rather take a dart on one of these young guys, these rookies potentially breaking out, a Josh Downs who was just like straight up productive last year, over like an aging, kind of falling off wide receiver in a pretty unfavorable landing spot. So that is going to wrap it up for my least favorite picks. Let me know your thoughts. Do you agree, disagree with my calls? Let me hear it down below. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.